Okay, so now we're going to get into loops and how we can use them for keeping running totals. And loops are a great way to do that because once we get inside the loop, we can go ahead and just keep some type of running total. Now we basically have two switches or two items that we're going to discuss. And the first one is called the accumulator, and that's basically a value, or I should say a variable, where we're going to just keep adding to, and that's going to be our running total basically. And then we have what's called a sentinel, and a sentinel is basically a variable that allows us to stop the loop. Okay, so it's that item that we reach and says, I'm done with the loop, let's get out. So if we take a look at total sales on page 221, there I have looks like four variables. I've got integer days, double sales, double total sales, and string input. I'm using JOption pane, and I'm also using a decimal format. So I'm importing those two items. So decimal format dollar equals new decimal format. So again, kind of a little bit of review there. I want to use the comma thousand separator and basically two decimal places. Input is basically string. Use J option where it says for how many days do you have sales figures, and I go ahead and say days is equal to parse basically whatever I get my input, so into an integer. And then I say total sales is 0.0, and then I have a for loop. And the for loop says, first thing, now this is kind of a new thing that we haven't talked about, is look at this. I've got a variable called count, and I'm actually creating it right here. So I've actually declared the variable right there within the for loop. I didn't have to declare it outside of it. So basically what I'm saying is I want to create a variable called count, and let's go ahead and start at 1. Again, this is our while statement. Do while this is true, and we're going to increment by that amount. We're going to add 1 to each of them. So input into the sales for the day, which is the count and basically whatever. So first time through it's a 1, then it's a 2, 3, 4, so on and so forth. And we go ahead and then type in the sales for that day. And I say total sales, which first time through total sales is 0.0, and I add sales to it. See how I'm doing the plus equal? That says add sales to total sales. I hit this last brace right here. We go ahead and increment count by 1. We go back up and we check. Is that statement still true? And if it is, we continue through the loop. So we keep going through, asking for sales, and then once we get through, we basically get out. So it looks like how many days you're going to type in, like say 5 days. It's going to go through that loop 5 times, and then once we get done, we go ahead and type in the total sales, and it will be properly formatted. So if we were to run this, it's not too bad. So how many days? We'll just go ahead and say 4, and the first day we'll say is 20, the second day is 30, the next day is 50, and the next day is 100. Day 4, so the total sales were 200. So 20 and 30 is 50, 50 is 100, add another 100 to it, now it's $200. So notice how it's really nice and formatted there as well in a currency data type. So not too bad. And then our system.exit 0, that basically kills the program and lets us get out. Okay, so now let's take a look at soccer points. So that's an accumulator. So in that particular case, total sales is the accumulator. Every time we typed in sales, it would be added to the accumulator total sales. So if we look at soccer points, this is a little different. So here I've got two variables. I've got points, I've got total points. I'm initializing total points to 0. I'm going ahead and use the keyboard to basically get information from the screen. Enter the number of points in your team that has earned each game this season. Enter a -1 when finished. So here we're actually telling the user to enter a sentinel value. when we get to a -1, we know we're done and we're going to stop. We're relying on the user to type that in. So get the first number of points. End of the game points are -1 to end. We get those points. While points are not equal -1, we're going to do this loop. Now this can be slightly dangerous because now we're relying on the user to enter in a value to kill the loop. So, but that's a sentinel value. So once they type in a -1, boom, it's done. So I'm not going to go through this whole loop because we basically know what that's all about, but realize a new term called sentinel value. Let's go to clock. Now, clock is kind of a new feature in that we now are dealing with nested loops. That's a loop inside of a loop. So if we take a look at this, here I've got a 4, a 4, and a 4. Now, this first 4 says do this, so we're going to initialize hours. We're going to set it to 1. So we're going to create a new variable called hours, set it to 1, start at 1 I should say. And then while hours is less than or equal to 12, we're going to increment hours by 1. And then minutes, we start at 0. While it's less than or equal to 59, we increment it by 1. And then seconds starts at 0. Again, seconds less than or equal to 59. And now, realize that this loop is going to execute 60 times, and it's inside of this loop which is going to also execute 60 times. So 60 times 60 is how many times it's going to take to get through this second loop. Then multiply that times 12. So 60 times 60 times 12. That's how many times this line right here is going to execute. Okay, and it's going to print out 2 decimal place, 2 decimal place, 2 decimal place, hours, minutes, seconds. So again, if you remember, this last 02D is the seconds, the next one is the minutes, and the first one is the hours. So if we run this, and it probably will run a little bit, as you can see, it's basically going through, and it's going to write out 60 seconds, 1 through 60, and then within that it's going to do another, it's going to add 1 to the minutes. Okay, so as you can see, it took a little bit to run through it, but it ran basically through an entire time in basically a 24-hour period. Okay, so those are nested loops. And realize that how many times this is going to run and how many times this is going to run, multiply those two together, and that's how many times this will run as well. Okay, so pretty much simple math. Be careful with nested loops because again, they're really easy to get into a never-ending loop. So kind of a real-life situation besides a clock is if we take a look at the test average 2 on page 226, and so here we have INT num students, num tests, scores, total, and then double the average. And again, we're getting some information from our scanner keyboard. We're asking how many students do we have, how many test scores per student, and then we're going to basically say this is the number of students. We're going to loop through all the different students, and then within there we're going to loop through all the different tests per students. So if there were 10 students and each student took 2 tests, basically that line is going to execute 20 times basically. So that's again, I'm not going to step through this because it's pretty much just like the last one. Again, it's going to go through this loop 10 times, 1 per student, and this is going to basically do this for each test for each student. Now, some really cool things on page 228, starting 228, 229. It talks about loops with patterns, and these are kind of cool because it's going to make some actual cool little patterns on the screen. So if I open up the rectangular pattern, there we basically have a for loop inside of a for loop. And we're going to ask how many rows do you want, how many columns do you want. And then it basically said, now this is a really good one to think about, rows and columns, because most of our tabular tables are in columns and rows. So this really kind of will hit home if you ever get into a tabular type of situation. So we're actually going to do this. So it's going to ask how many rows, how many columns, and again multiply those two together, and that's how many times this is going to execute. So so basically what it's going to do, it's going to print out a row of asterisks, and then this next system is going to go down one line. So it's like basically print a row and then drop down a line. So if we were to run this, we'll say 5 rows and we'll say 8 columns. And look at that. So here's 5 rows, 8 columns across. There's a nice little square. So here's what it does. It's going to basically do one row. Inside of that first row, it says how many columns do we want? It wants 8 columns in this case. So it's going to basically print this 8. It's going to print this asterisk 8 times, one right after the other. Then this syst out print line says go drop down a line. That's all it says. So it drops down a line. Then it goes through this loop again. It basically, it hits this loop, which drops down a row, and it basically prints 8 more asterisks. Then it drops down a line. Then it goes back up to this loop, which basically is the third line, and it basically goes through this loop 8 times, printing 8 asterisks. This says drop down a line, and then it basically, so you kind of get the gist there. Okay. So now on the next page, 230, talks about a triangle pattern. So if we take a look at that, here we have a for loop and a for loop. Now this one's a little different in that we're actually incrementing, we're actually adding the row plus 1. Okay, so actually basically instead of basically doing 1 asterisk, we'll do 1 asterisk and then we'll do one extra, 1 extra, 1 extra, 1 extra. So if we run this guy, notice it didn't ask for any input in this case, and there it types in 1, then 2, then 3, then 4, then 5, so on and so forth. Okay, so and then the last one is what's called the stair step, which is kind of like the triangle, except instead of asterisks, it's only wants to print 1 asterisk with spaces. And how many spaces is it going to print? Well, the first time it's going to print no space. Second time is 1 space, then asterisk, then 2 spaces, an asterisk, 3 spaces, an asterisk. So we take a look at the stair step, and again you can see there's our space. How many spaces is it going to print along with a pound sign? And again, if we run this, there is our stair step down. Okay, so step through those, look at them, desk check them, see what's going on, and we'll see you for the last little bit. I think that's it. I really do think that's it. So okay, that's it for this week. We will see you next week. Again, if you have any questions, make sure you email me, call me, whatever the case may be, text me, maybe use the forums, and I basically see you guys down the road. Thanks.